Callan started in the most curious way. I'd been working very hard, and I'd done quite a lot of television. And I wanted to go on holiday, and it's the first time that I'd been on holiday with my family for years. So we'd all booked it, and it was all ready to go. And I lived just down the road from the television studios, Thames Television Studios, just outside London on the river. And I suppose it's 4 days before I was due to go. There was a script put through the letterbox, and working on the premise that an actor can never resist reading a script. I mean, you can put it off, but you can never resist reading it. And I thought, well, I can't put it off, you see, because I'm going to be away for 3 weeks. So I read it, and I knew there and then that I had to do it. It was an armchair theatre, and it was called Callan, and it was about this, what later became an anti-hero called Callan. And I read it, and I had to tell my wife that we couldn't go on holiday, that we was going to be postponed, which was really charming. And the children cried a lot, and we all cried a lot except me, but I knew I had to do this part. And it was one of those things that obviously it had been offered to somebody else. Nobody ever said that, but you always know, if you get it late, you know that it's been offered to somebody else, and that they've said no or they couldn't do it, and you're the second choice. Actors are nearly always second choice. We always realise that in our lives. But I didn't care about that, so I said yes, I'd do it. I started it 10 days later. It was then turned into a television series. And that's how it came about. Not exactly by accident, but the casting director afterwards said to me, she knew perfectly well that she knew I was going on holiday because she'd heard. And she knew that if she phoned me up or phoned my agent up and said, hey, look, there is this, I'd say, no, I don't even want to read it. So she deliberately put it through the letterbox, knowing I'd have to read it. So that's how it started. There's a strange thing when you start something and it's turned into a series. You have mixed feelings about it. You want it to succeed. On the other hand, you don't want to get trapped in a character. I knew when we did this, made it. I knew it was such a very good script. I mean, James Mitchell is a superb writer, and I knew that this was going to be. If it went into series, I knew it was going to be successful. I don't think you ever know how successful things are until you're finished and look back on them. These days, of course, you, especially in America, you do a television series, and if it's successful, you do 22 in 1 year, then you do 22 the next, then you can go on for 11 years, by which time the actors become multi-millionaires. It didn't work that way in those days. It still doesn't work that way in England anyway, but it didn't work that way at all in those days. It was very much on a sort of old boys network system, really. The producer said, look, old chap, he'd say, look, Edward, we've done 6. They're pretty successful. How do you feel about doing another 6, or another 13? And, you'd say, well, yeah, I can't do it at the moment because, or yes, that would be a great idea, whatever. And you say, yes, I'd love to do it, or, but I can't do it now. I've got to wait for a little while I'm doing something else, if you're lucky. And so that's really basically what happened to Callan. I mean, we did 6, then nobody mentioned it for about 7 or 8 months. I went out, it was pretty successful. And then then the producer said, look, we'd like to do another 13. How you fix? So I said, yeah, that's fine, yeah. Did another 13. About another 6 months went by, and how are you fixed for another 13? I said, I can't do another 13 yet, because I'm going, Laurence Olivier's asked me to go to the National Theatre to play some lovely parts. Right, well, when you finish, let's know. So I finished 18 months later, and they called me up and said, how are you fixed now? Yes, fine. So we did another 13. And that's the way it was. And over 6 years, I think we only did, I think it was about 46. And then I don't know what happened then. I think, I know, yes, well, Jim Mitchell himself thought, I can't do any more, I've done enough. Although he didn't write them all, he wrote most of them. He certainly wrote the best. There was a mutual decision to finish. What we decided was a natural time. Callan was very strange in its impact on the television public. To start with, it was the first time that there'd ever been a sort of anti-hero. People were really shocked by the fact that he was not a very nice man. That was why he's so good to play, because you never knew quite what he was going to do. The second most important, and it may have been the first, I don't know, but was the relationship between Callan and the character Lonely, the smelly little man who he got to do a lot of his dirty work. It was, I think, the classic television combination, pairing. It was absolutely superb in the way that Jim had written these two characters, the way they sparked off each other. And it caught the public's imagination tremendously. I think that probably was the most important reason why it succeeded. Added to which the producer was absolutely determined that he was going to get the best actors he could to guest and to play guest roles. Therefore, the roles of the guest people had to be just as good as the leads. And that is something that's quite often forgotten in the series. And it's certainly forgotten, I think, a great deal these days. Certainly in England, I think it's forgotten. That the so-called peripheral characters are just as important as the main characters. If you watch really good movies, and you see there's big stars in really good movies, but the movies are carried by the small part players, the smaller part players, each of whom are written superbly. They're rounded characters. 99 times out of 10, those characters are rounded and full. You could actually tell a whole story about every character in the movie if you wanted to. And that's the way that characters should be written. And that's the way they're not written so much these days. You get the leads, and then everybody else is an also-rans. But in the time of Callan, and in the time of most television series at that time, and certainly all movies at that time, every single character was a rounded, complete human being. Lonely, I think, probably was I keep using the word classic, but he was the classic character, almost, I think, of the 20th century in television. He was a nasty little man, with a sort of heart of gold, in a way, but he was very vulnerable. He was an outcast. He smelt. There's something curious about a person who smells. They really are outcasts, and it had never been written in that way before. It was a character that you felt sorry for and at the same time felt annoyed about. So you kind of understood to a certain extent, the audience kind of understood Callan's attitude to Lonely. Every week they waited to see what was coming up, how he was going to berate him the next week. Was he going to physically abuse him? What kind of job was he going to set him? How was Lonely going to mess up, They waited for Callan's reaction to his smell. Mate, you pong, you really pong. I mean, and they waited for that sort of thing. So we had to be very careful about how often you did it. I mean, you had to do it with your face, and just slightly, more often than not. It was a beautifully written character, a beautifully understood character. But above all, it was the most beautifully played character by Russell Hunter. There was a case here of an actor having fallen into a role which he created, which had already been created by Jim Mitchell. But actor's job is to basically recreate the author's intentions. And this was a creation of Russell's that was absolutely superb. There was at the time a very strange comparing. People started to compare, or certain pundits, certain newspaper people, writers, started to compare James Bond and Callan. I mean, James Bond had basically almost just started out film-wise, anyway. Callan had, and they tried to compare the two, which I thought was kind of foolish in a way, because James Bond was a sort of great, wonderful figment of a writer's imagination, which was based on a certain amount of truth, but really it was, as my dad would say, really far-fetched, and deliberately so. Callan was based, I think, much more on a truthful fantasy. I mean, one's a semi-truthful fantasy, the other's a more truthful fantasy. Callan was based on a sort of down-to-earth sort of character. They were not generations apart. They were the same generation, but they were poles apart in terms of where they came from in life. One was quite extraordinarily well educated, and the other one was hardly educated at all. One was an officer class, and the other one was a sergeant broken down to private with a chip on his shoulder, which was Callan. So they couldn't compete in any possible way. The fact that they captured the imagination of the people, one on film and one on television, was, I thought, quite, fascinating and a good thing. The whole business of television in those days was it was very different to today. 30, 20, what was it, 25 years ago? I can't remember, 25 years ago. Odd. It was very, very different. In a way, it was comparatively new television, really, compared with now. There was much more a bigger excitement about it. It was people. I remember Callan went out on a Wednesday, and there was football on a Wednesday quite often, and they would often cancel the football, put the football out on a Thursday, because they knew that most people would be watching Callan, so they would change the day. Now, they wouldn't do that these days, for anything. Not for anything would they do it. Football is king, football is God, football is money. They wouldn't do it. And I don't think, and I'm not being rude or angry or looking back with any kind of bitterness or anything, because I'm doing very well, thank you very much at the moment, and I'm enjoying my life, theatrically speaking, and in every other way. But there was a sense of occasion about good television then. There really was. People did stay in. People did, and occasionally they do now, but they nearly always do it again for football or for sport. Very rarely do it for drama, or very rarely do it for a series. So it kind of made its benchmark, its little mark in television history. Very proud of that. Playing the character of Callan had an astonishing effect on my career. It was very, very important at the time, television-wise. It had a tremendous viewing, and it was quite exciting in terms of continuing to do it and continuing to engage the public, shall we say. It was talked about a lot, very flattering to be in it. And it was an astonishing piece of writing, so therefore it was a great joy to do it. Wonderful role to play. It had the effect of turning me into a national figure, a television figure to start with. But the most important thing it did, though, was to engage the attention of Laurence Olivier, God rest his soul, who was, and to most of my generation is, the god of theatre in italics. And he wrote me a most wonderful letter. About the third year of Callan, I'd taken a break, and I was doing a musical called Tale of Two Cities. Two Cities it was called. And I was playing Sidney Carton, because, I did a lot of musicals and recordings. But I was doing this musical at the Palace Theatre in London. And he came to see it, and he wrote me the most wonderful letter, inviting me to the National Theatre, and saying that he had watched he rarely had time to watch television, but he had watched Callan occasionally, and he thought it was absolutely superb, and I was the kind of actor he wanted at the National and all that. Well, this was like Mount Olympus calling you down, saying, "Hey, come up here," that was absolutely astonishing. So we were just about to get ready. We weren't actually going to start. There was no start date, but we were going to get ready to do another series. We knew that. And I had to say, look, I'm sorry, fellas. I'm going to the National Theatre for at least 18 months. And then, as I said earlier, they said, "Oh, right, fine, my dear chap. Yeah, of course you've got to do that. Yes, absolutely, yes. No problem, let's all get together when. And Russell said, "My God, you've got to do that. Yeah, I go off and do my one-man show," and he went off and did his one-man show, which is a wonderful one-man show called The Scottish Soldier, I think, at that time. So there I went to the National Theatre, and I did Cyrano de Bergerac, which is, the man with the big nose and the wonderful fighting. I did that, which was superb. And I did Flamineo in the White Devil, which is probably the most evil man ever written. And I was going to do, what I was really contracted to do was Guys and Dolls. And Olivia was going to be playing, the in italic Sinatra part, which he had lots of new songs and And I remember Laurence Olivier going, God rest him, he was going round and round the National Theatre going, oh, these and those, these and those, these and those, learning his accent, these and those, hey, buddy, hey, these and those, these and those. Now, the one thing about Sir Laurence, or Lord Olivier, was that he was the greatest actor in the world, but he did have a little difficulty in some accents, which made him human, which made all of us actors say, oh, well, God, it's just the same as we are, really. So we always spent, hours and hours and hours, days and months perfecting what he was going to do. So seeing him go around doing do's and don'ts, do's and don'ts. I was still actually rehearsing Charlotte de Bergerac. I hadn't even got anywhere near Guys and Dolls yet. Sky Masters I was going to play. Anyway, what happened was he fell ill, and it was shelved. And then we were about to do it again about 6 months later, and he fell ill again. And so it was shelved basically for good, until they still had it. They still had the rights, and about 10 years later, it was done. Olivier wasn't there anymore at that time. It was done and was enormously successful. One of the most successful musicals they've ever done at the National Theatre. But it was a pity. It was the one great regret I had that I didn't play Sky Masterson opposite Laurence Olivier, I must say. Sad. But life is full of sadness, is it not? Playing a character like that is inclined to affect you for the rest of your life, really. Certainly for as long as there are people who remember it, and those still are. We're getting on a bit. But, I don't think there's one day of my life goes by. In fact, there isn't one day of my life goes by that somebody doesn't come up to me and talk about it, mention it in some way or another. So therefore, it's a sort of rung, a very solid one in the climb to success, whatever that is. And it's also something, basically, at my age, to look back on and say, if I never did anything else, I did that. But I mean, very luckily, I did do other things. I did other things that were wonderful, wonderful roles because of that character. If you're lucky enough in your life to play something that is enormously successful, the chances are that you will become reasonably successful in other parts later on. There are some who don't, and that is kind of sad. But most of us who do are lucky enough to get a good role when we're reasonably young. We can build on that, and I certainly was able to build on the Callan character. The film of Callan happened as sort of natural progression. In those days, there were lots of movies made of successful television series. Some worked and some didn't. The ones that were inclined to work more than any others were the comedies. They seemed to have a better chance of succeeding. With drama, it seemed that there was almost two totally separate audiences. An audience for film drama and an audience for television drama, and quite often they didn't merge. Callan, I think, was reasonably successful in that it did merge, as it were, with both audiences. The difference was complete. When you're doing a television series, of course, you've got the same crew, the same people working on it, and you have your same team of actors. When we came to do the movie, which was quite a long time after the series had finished, we didn't have the same acting team. Russell and I, as Callan and Lonely, were about the only ones of the original team in it. The film script was of the original television episode, the opening episode. So Russell and I were doing sort of going back on old territory. There was some changes, but not very many. As far as we were concerned when we were shooting it, of course, there again, shooting film is very different to shooting video. And of course, Callan, the series, was mostly all video with filmed inserts. You have a different regime, you have a different timetable. You get up much earlier when you're doing movies. You finish earlier than you do when you're doing television. But playing the same characters, there wasn't a great deal of difference. The difference was in the people around you. They had not done the television series, therefore they were quite wisely creating their own characters. This was a little bit difficult for both Russell and myself, and certainly myself too, at the beginning, to get on the same level, shall we say. But in the end, I did, and it was far enough away from the actual series to make me really happy that I was making a sort of further acquaintance with Callan. I enjoyed making the movie, but then it was from Callan that I discovered I enjoyed making movies anyway. So it was a great experience. It was a very good experience. But looking back on the film of Callan, it was a great experience because I hadn't done very many movies. I think, in fact, I'd only done one. I'd been in a couple, but I hadn't had a massive role. This is I think the second lead I had. No, the first major lead I had, I think, in a film. And it was a great experience. Filming is a wonderful experience anyway. And you get a director like Don Sharp, and you get somebody, and you get a crew who are experienced. And the wonderful thing about doing that series was that every single member of the crew was a great fan of the series. So they kind of knew the characters extremely well. And working on it was one of those things you look back on with great joy, great pleasure. Not nostalgia, but pleasure and joy. Part of the business that one was in that was good, and it represented, to me, probably the best character I've ever had, and ever will have, I think.